and the upper caste scientists have given India a Brahmanical, has given a Brahmanical identity to science in India. They have been perceived to be the natural inheritors of scientific practice because of their privileged historical position and their oppression of the Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi academics. Even after the introduction of various inclusive policies such as reservations for marginalized groups in educational institutions, there is still a stark absence of such groups in India's leading scientific research institutions. Available data shows that there are very few scientists from the Dalit and other marginalized sections in most of the leading Indian scientific and technical educational institutions. In recent times, there have been several instances of caste-based discrimination in STEM institutions. One might be reminded of Payal Tadvi, a medical student who committed suicide on May 22, 2019, after facing casteist harassment by three of her seniors at Topiwala National Medical College and BYL Nair Hospital. In modern India, caste still continues to discriminate against scholars and scientists in STEM fields who belong to the marginalized sections of society. Meghnad Saha was an Indian physicist who did much of his work in the last decades of British colonial rule. In the 1920s, he made important contributions to the theory of thermal ionization and its application to stellar spectra. He would continue to be a leader in modern physics in colonial and post-colonial India and to earn international renown. His story is particularly noteworthy for at least two reasons. First, he was born in an obscure village in Bengal to a lower caste family with no educational background. He had to work hard to transcend the stereotypes associated with his social status. Secondly, he saw his work as facilitating the process of decolonization, a goal that was finally achieved with the Indian Independence Act of 1947. Today, we remember his legacy as we organize this lecture in his memory. Our speaker today is Professor Abha Sur. Abha Sur is a scientist turned historian of science. She received her PhD in physical chemistry from Vanderbilt University and postgraduate training in the field of multi-photon ionization, spectroscopy at SUNI, Stony Brook, and yet Yale University. She has published several articles in chemistry. Her most recent research focuses on the history of modern science in India from a subaltern perspective. Her book, Dispersed Radiance, Caste, Gender, and Modern Science in India examines the confluence of caste, nationalism, and gender in science and unpacks the colonial context in which science was organized. Abha Sur was a fellow at the Bunting Institute at Harvard University and at the Dibna Institute for the History of Science and Technology at MIT. She is presently a lecturer in the program in Women's and Gender Studies and research associate in the program in Science, Technology, and Society at MIT. I would welcome her on behalf of SFRA and request her to take over.
Thanks, Ananya, for that introduction and for starting us off on this occasion of Meghnad Saha's birth anniversary. I actually do not use Google Meet very often. Is there a way for me to share my screen?
There will be a share screen option just at the bottom of the screen. There's an arrow, upwards arrow. Do you see that, ma'am?
Present now? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So maybe I'll just go there and see what I'm able to see. Your entire screen. Oh gosh. So what am I doing? Sorry. Where is my...
Ma'am, you can share the entire screen or you can choose the window and select the PPT.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, a window. Okay. All right. That makes sense. Okay. Are you... I don't know what you're seeing and what I'm seeing. It's
it's being presented. Yeah.
Okay. So now I can't see you, unfortunately, but anyway, we'll live with that. So I'm going to today talk about some issues on science and caste, and it's mainly based on my the work that I have done earlier. Okay, so let me begin with just a brief understanding of how I look at science and how other philosophers that I think highly of have looked at science. So, so we often associate science with objectivity. And what that means is that we say that, oh, when we go into the lab, we only worry about the data that is in front of us. We look at it with neutrality. And so whatever is produced is actually objective and authentic. But as we know from the ways in which the social enterprise of science works in our world, is that it is backed by, you need huge amounts of money, you need your laboratories. There is a whole hierarchy of institutions whose work is much more available and who kind of dominate the field. So there is an internal working of science which is supposedly free of the social pressures and the social proclivities of the scientists that are doing the science. So a lot of philosophers of science right now are thinking much more about how science is socially mediated. What is it about the process of science that that it can still produce some real truths, even though, and not always, I have to say, because if one has to look at the science of race and caste and gender, one finds that science has hardly been on the right side of things or has produced truths. But in any case, if one looks at the natural world, one can sort of more or less agree that socially mediated science can still produce some real truths about the world. So this is a basic contradiction, and this contradiction is going to remain with us till we have a different world altogether. Or maybe even there we would always, any social activity is going to have influences of the dominant thinking of that time. So one of the people that I have kind of gone to understand the nature of science, if you will, is Roy Bhaskar, which is a first step towards trying to understand what science is. And it's called critical realism. And this philosophy says that science, of course, is a social activity. Gone are the days when we think of a single person, mainly a man, sort of meditating and trying to come up with scientific theories. What we understand science to be is a social activity, a transitive process dependent upon earlier knowledges and the social conditions in which knowledge is produced. So it also sort of says that, if in physics in particular, that the knowledge produced is of intransitive objects of nature. So the social nature is transitive, whereas the objects of science are intransitive, whose properties and attributes are independent of human activity. For instance, if you were to study calcium or sodium, you would say, those are intransitive. Nothing that we are doing, is affecting that process. So it distinguishes between real objects belonging to the intransitive dimension and the objects of knowledge, which are necessarily human constructs, which are transitive dimensions. You can stop me anytime, so anyway, let me go on. But then we also understand from now advances in science that science, can in fact make changes in the intransitive dimension also, right? Because we have technologies that can alter the nature of reality itself. So we talk about plasticity in science, which is science is knowledge generated by the interaction of a knowing and adaptable subject with a plastic, changeable, and transformable object. So it's talking both about those that are studying and the properties of what is being studied, So this interaction entails experiment, theory, and technology. Furthermore, the knowing subject of the interaction is not an autonomous individual, but an active agent rooted in the historical, cultural, social, and economic community with shared preconceptions and traditions. So what it's trying to do is that as scientists, we come to the laboratory with certain preconceived notions. And these notions are rooted in our social world in a way. Right? And if one actually looks at the science of race, for instance, or science of gender, we see these the ways in which the person who's doing the study is so rooted in the social world that they have inhabited that all kinds of what I would say idiocy or were seen as truth about gender and race. And then, and lastly, we want to say that science is necessarily mediated knowledge, which explains both its hermeneutic aspects and dogmatic tendencies. So it's okay. I mean, let's go on. We can come back to that if there's need to be. So what I've been trying to tell you is that there are two dimensions to science, at least. The dimension of the intransitive, or now not so intransitive, but malleable object, and the ways in which the scientist brings to the study their own preconceived notions. So there is this internal dimension to science and external dimension to science. And what I thought was kind of interesting was, if those of you who know what a Mobius strip is, it's a strip which you have a little kink and then you join it. So the outside and inside forms a continuous surface. So the Mobius strip is a contiguous curved surface that has no clear demarcation between the inside and the outside. So for instance, if you were to travel on the inside, very soon you'd be on the outside without even understanding, that you're now on the outside. And so we generally associate scientific theories, experimental paradigms, methodology, innovation, etc., with the inner workings of science, whereas the cultural, political, and philosophical moorings of the scientists are considered to be external factors, often detrimental to doing good science, right? So that anyway, where am I understanding science? So with this respect, I want to say that I've been very influenced by two very good, very deeply progressive scientists in our part of the world, in Cambridge, where I live, Dick Lewontin and Dick Levins, who wrote this really remarkable book called The Dialectics of Science. Okay, I'm just messing up on everything here. Anyway, so Levins and Lewontin wrote in their book, The Dialectical Biologist, I believe, that ideology strongly predisposes us to see some things in the world and not others. Ideas of cause and effect, subject and object, part and whole, form an intellectual frame that delimits our construction of reality, although we are barely aware of its existence, or if we are, we affirm it as a self-evident reality that must constrain all thought. Dominant ideologies set the tone for theoretical investigations of phenomena, which then become a reinforcing practice of the ideology itself. And I'll come back to that, and the examples that I will give you about my own work actually highlight the ways in which these ideologies of scientists kind of dictate the kind of science they do and how they think about their science. And I'll do that with respect to a controversy that C.V. Raman had with Max Born that continued for decades. Anyway, so I'll come to that later. But what Levins and Lewontin are trying to tell us is that what we see when we are actually looking at these objects disinterestedly, for that matter, is that it's impossible to actually break out of that, to create a space which is purely objective, because we see what we want to see, what we've been, sort of socialized into seeing, and we take it to be the truth. Let me see if I can. So in this respect, like I said, I'm going to now shift to some of the work that I have done. And here I want to revisit this paper that I wrote now a few decades ago. It's called The Raman-Bohn Controversy in Lattice Dynamics. And then I'll talk about Meghnad Saha's ionization equation, and where I'll also try to argue that there is some notion of selectivity that he's grappling with, because it is pertinent to his own life in a way. And then I want to also then come and talk about some of the work that Mahalanobis did on in doing these UP surveys and Bengal surveys, and how, again, his preconceived notions about what caste should be, how it should be represented, very much come into the ways in which he looks at his data. So I'll talk about these three issues now. So the Bohn-Raman controversy has to do with, if you look at the spectrum of diamond, for instance, right? I mean, even if, I don't know how many of you have a science background, but, the diamond has internal degrees of vibration. And what spectroscopy, which is something I studied when I was in science, it tries to say, what are these frequencies? How do we understand the internal energy states of these, diamonds or molecules in general? So what you expect from looking at a vibrational spectra of diamond is that you would see some 40 or more frequencies. And so Bohn, who was a theoretical chemist or physicist, he had come up with this, what should the spectra look like? And it was a continuum with some few lines on top of the continuum. Raman, who did experiments in his own laboratory, insisted that actually there are only 9 frequencies that you can see, and there is no other possible. I mean, he said that's all there is to. Even though if you looked at his own laboratory, you would see that if you look at the spectrum, that there is a kind of there's a continuum on which these spectral lines appear very strongly. But he said, no, there is no background at all. So Bohn, who did the theoretical calculations and talked about that there is a continuum and there are some lines that are on top of that. But Bohn actually did not pay much attention to those lines either, for that matter. But the point that I want to stress here is that in Raman's worldview, something as perfect as a crystal cannot possibly have random vibrations, because each in this perfect crystal, or this perfect diamond, every little atom must know its place. It may not, do haphazard or movement which is not totally in line with its beautiful symmetry. So he kind of said no. So the controversy continued forever in the scientific literature. So he wrote, the assumption made by Bohn are equivalent to the assertion that while the static arrangement of the atoms in a crystal is one of perfect order and regularity, the dynamic character of their movements is one of perfect chaos and disorder. Indeed, exactly of the same kind as the movement or vibrations of a molecule of a gas. This conclusion is obviously so improbable that we may well feel justified in rejecting without hesitation the premises on which it is based. So you find here Raman, the scientist, saying, oh, we don't have to worry about it at all, because he was so firm in his belief that this beautiful crystal has to obey the laws. I mean, if you take it a step further, that's the life that he has. There are castes, and they each should know their place in their society. You may not transgress. You may only, your movement must conform to your place in the world. So I argue with actually a lot of, this is a quote from Raman himself. And you can see that the way in which he structured his laboratory, the ways in which he thinks about his science is very much imbued with the caste status he has, because you cannot admit chaotic vibrations, because that would imply that Kali Yuga is here already. I mean, he doesn't quite say it, I'm saying it. But if you look at the way in which because the controversy could have been easily resolved, because you could say, oh yes, there's a continuum, and on top of it, these are these sharp lines, and these sharp lines are when in fact the molecules are in phase. So Raman is not wrong to be able to identify the intensity of these lines with in phase and out of phase sort of movements, but yet to deny that there is also all kinds of other movements that happen is something that is so alien to his cultural being as a Brahmin scientist. So he did not, till the very end, he never ever gave in to that controversy. So in my work, of course, I look at the structure of his lab, the ways in which he distinguished between different students, their calibers, etc. And so it's a pretty hierarchical system which will brook no disorder of any kind. So let me see. So that was one of the things that I have written about quite in detail. The second thing that I want to, so similarly, I want to talk about ideological resonances in Saha's ionization equation. And as we know, in the 1920s, Saha was instrumental in converting this very qualitative field. You'd look at the stars and they were, classified according to their colors, kind of, but there was no quantification. And Saha's great contribution was that he, looked at the early quantum mechanics as well as classical mechanics to come up with an understanding of why the intensity of stars, and actually that's the beginning of the quantification of the astrophysics as we know it today. And here I have argued, and it's much more tentative because unlike Raman, Saha is very circumspect. He does not, dwell into any social, world, or is not so flamboyant as to say, oh, we can dismiss it out of hand, etc. He's very, very careful in the way he writes. But I was kind of intrigued by why is he so taken up with the issue of selectivity, because what he's looking at that time is that they find that there are certain calcium atoms that are much higher in the atmosphere of a sun than than the theory would have, or any understanding would have predicted. And here Saha, if you look at the ways in which he phrases it, and he says there is no reason why sun should discriminate against any X, Y, or Z. The radiation, sun's radiation is constant. And then he kind of comes up with the theory of, that different atoms have different ionization potentials. And then, he builds a whole theory on why calcium should be much above in the sun's atmosphere than would be predicted. So here I was struck by not only Saha's, sort of focus on exclusivity and selectivity, but also in some ways, at the time that he's doing this work, he's also very much involved in what's happening in Calcutta University. There's this Calcutta University Commission that is called for, and they interview 400 or more people to come up with this, to talk about what's going on in Calcutta University, what is the status, what should be the recommendations. And one of the things that Saha talks about there is that there was this proposal made that we should have different hostels for students belonging to different castes. And Saha said, just rails against it, saying, this is just absurd. Why would you? If there are people who do not want to eat with other students, it's their problem. The government should not, institute discrimination. I could read from my book, but which to give you the exact wording. But what is striking about Saha's, what I do in my book is I compare Brajendra Seal's, again, he's opposed to the same thing, that you shouldn't have different hostels, and Saha's also opposition to this, but the language used is so different. Saha is talking about the privileges of the upper caste and the ways in which they have dominated, whereas Saha is talking about how it's a kind of a liberal position where they've been degraded and that's not right, etc. So whereas Saha puts the blame squarely on the upper caste that have dominated the system, and he said, well, if they don't want to live, let them find their own ways of living off campus, but the government should not interfere. But the language of selectivity and the language of that the government should not discriminate, just like the sun doesn't discriminate. That's what I'm saying. He doesn't say it. Is very much prevalent, very much palpable in the ways in which he writes, very in that survey that was published about Calcutta University. So when I talk about ideological resonances in Saha's equation, I go back to the ways in which his social position in the world and the ways in which he looks at those very much, kind of comes into the ways in which he begins to look at nature and solar spectra as well. Okay, so that was my second example. And now if I can go back to the third example very briefly. So, and this is now, so earlier work was, Saha's work was in the 1920s. Raman's was in the 40s and goes on for a very long, in 30s, from 30s onwards, and goes on for 30, 40 years. Mahalanobis distance, which Mahalanobis is known for, it's a huge contribution in the field of statistics. And it comes about because he's interested in looking at UP, the surveys. He conducts these surveys with the help of two other scientists. And the reason why he's doing it is that he's very influenced by Karl Pearson. And where he wants to prove that the caste structure in India is very much akin to racial structure in India. And so, the theory of earlier of caste has been that, these are separated by, the kind of work people do, and that's what leads to the caste system. Whereas Mahalanobis and Risley are saying, no, there is a racial basis to caste. that the distinction have something to do with the ways in which, race, it's an exemplification of the racial differences in the population. So he goes about measuring, and he, hires an anthropologist, and they work together. And what they come up with, and of course they develop all the statistics around, which is now called the Mahalanobis distance. They don't not only measure the skull sizes, they measure the. I beg your pardon? Am I? Yeah. Is there a question? Okay. This is hard.
No, ma'am. Actually, it was someone. I think someone has put the microphone on. That's it.
Okay.
You can continue. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So anyway, what I mean, I'm just condensing this sort of longish paper into a paragraph. So the point here is that they go through all the measurements and measure everything under the sun. And then they have this weighted distribution that they do, and they try to, and this is what Mahalanobis's distance is all about. And then they come up with certain, sort of the finding. So I'm just reading from the UP survey that Mahalanobis wrote. And he says, on the whole, the Brahmins are distinctly of a larger build than other castes and tribes, with two exceptions. They are the tallest and have the largest sitting height, which particular character varies widely from group to group. The Brahmins have medium nasal length, highest nasal depth, and narrow nasal breadth, not the narrowest, being wider than the nasal breadth of 4 or 5 groups. The size of the head is so big, with the largest head length, with the exception of Kshatris, and the largest head breadth, with the exception of Agharyas. Upper facial length is the largest, and the total facial length larger than most of the other groups. The width of the face is also large, facial breadth being the widest, and by bizygomatic and bigonial breadths widest, with only a few exceptions. So if you just look at this paragraph, it is kind of extraordinary, right? That how much, what lengths you have to go to show that the Brahmins are at the top, because there are always exceptions. Every little character that they have measured, the Brahmins don't really come out on top at all. So anybody who was actually, truthful to their data, one would say, well, this is all bogus. And of course, Mahalanobis had plenty of reason to believe that, because by this time, these studies, the anthropometric studies, have been totally discredited in the world. I mean, throughout the 19th century, for 70 odd years, people measured every part of the human body to try to come up with a kind of gradation that will mimic the gradation of the races that they have already quantified or qualified at this time, and none does. You look at English surveys, they put the Englishmen on top. You look at French, the French put their own people on the very top. You look at Americans, that's what they do. And of course, it's always the Caucasians on top and Africans on the bottom. And all kinds of, and Gould has written very, very persuasively about it as to how the methodology itself was so biased. But the point is, by the end of the 19th century, the beginning of 20th century, all of these have been totally discredited. And we have, all kinds of, there are, in the world at large, there's been huge criticism of racism, etc. So, and Mahalanobis is writing it in the 40s, this thing, and he's still clinging to some notion of coming up with, superiority of the Brahmins. So, what you find here is, let me see. So to go on with this, so in other words, Brahmins neither have the largest build, nor the narrowest nasal breadth, nor the largest head length or breadth. And yet Mahalanobis concluded on the basis of his anthropometric measurements and caste distance analysis that, and I quote, the Brahmins were traditionally the priestly class, occupying the highest social status in the Vedic age, and have retained their position at the apex of Hindu society up to the present time. They are clearly and unmistakably differentiated from all other groups and may reasonably be considered to be the modern representatives of the highest layer of the Vedic people speaking Indo-European or Indo-Aryan languages. So here, you can't really find a better example of the ways in which caste enters, the knowledge creation within India. And later on he did a Bengal survey, and by this time, the Bengal survey just gives him so-called mongrel populations. He tries very hard, and then that language itself is very interesting. The way in which they give up, they're forced to give up on these caste considerations in anthropometric work that they have done, and they're pretty sad about it, I must say, in those papers. But what is interesting about all of this is that the way in which particular branches of science continue in India, just because you have people who are in these leadership positions and they dictate what science is done, even though in the rest of the world there's been great criticism of this kind of research earlier. So those are the three examples I have given about the ways in which caste enters science, this objective science and value neutral science. And these are examples from physics, which is the most objective of all objective sciences, and of course from statistics and the antecedents, how that statistics comes about is also quite interesting, because it's based on these really questionable research. Anyway, so then I also sort of, since we're talking about science and caste, so all of this time I've been talking about the ways in which scientific knowledge is mediated by the power relations, by caste relations in some ways. Now I want to also turn briefly towards how representations, and what are the representations and erasures in science. So then I look at, in my book, Dispersed Radiance, I've looked at the ways in which scientists are represented in their own biographies and autobiographies, as well as from outside. And you find invariably that upper caste scientists, they either give you a whole lineage as to what illustrious families they come from, or if they can't trace that, they will go to some area, like in Raman's biography, they talk about Tanjore being this place where, culture flourished, upper caste sensibilities flourished, etc. And that's what, it's just part of this ambience of being upper caste. When you look at the biographies of, Meghnad Saha, for instance, there's very reluctant, Saha himself never expressed as to how he came from. He just said, I come from a lower middle class family. There was a kind of erasure of caste. And it's the same for women scientists of this time also. There's a kind of erasure, because to admit that you are part of the subaltern caste or gender is to be not accepted in science, because you can't bring in, the whole aura of objectivity means you can't bring your subjective experiences in it, except, of course, if you're upper caste, then everything is allowed and everything is seen as objective. So I've argued that the casting of physics as pure and sublime is not unlike the self-representations of the Brahmins. Physics reigns supreme in the hierarchy of sciences, and its characterization as a highbrow, objective, and abstract knowledge demands that its practitioners erase subjective experience, ideological biases, and social differences from their consideration. These constraints, however, function only for the subaltern. The biographies of upper caste scientists, as we have seen, invariably reinforce ideologies of caste, hierarchy, and power. Indeed, hierarchies of gender and caste on the one hand, and on the other, of science, ensured the compliance of women and low caste scientists in keeping the domain of physics unsullied, unencumbered by inventories of discrimination. So, when you talk about, when I was talking to Anna Mani, who was a student in Raman's laboratory, she would really, you sort of talk about gender, and she said, no, why? Do you have difficulty in doing research? We had no problems at all. She told me. And then I said, okay, that's fine. Tell me what was the culture in the laboratory? How was the lab, atmosphere? And then, as if the whole, some dam had burst, and she kind of talked about how any time they made a mistake, the women, it would be broadcast all over the map, how they were given these derogatory nicknames that kind of clung to them. And she wouldn't tell me what the name given to her was. But you could get from that conversation the everyday experiences in the laboratory where, it was not all awful, but at the same time, you knew what you could or could not do, where, what would be considered transgression. And so if we look at the ways in which science gets organized in a hierarchical system, whether it is racial hierarchy or it is caste hierarchy, is that it silences any and all dissent from the people who are on the lower rung of the social ladder, if you will. So the survival of the subaltern in the disciplines of the quintessentially modern sciences is incumbent upon silencing the language of caste, as well as demanding and enforcing that caste can live only secret lives outside the public sphere. Saha had incurred the ire of the upper caste firsthand when he made a rather mild criticism of the Hindu religion and the caste system in a lecture he delivered at Shantiniketan in 1938. Saha's main point was that craftsmen, artists, and builders have traditionally been placed quite low in the social hierarchy, which had engendered a lack of innovativeness in the techniques of production. So, what I'm trying to sort of, and when Saha had made this very mild critique of the caste system, mainly talking about how the separation of mind from the hand had led to kind of, had not, opened up the scientific field as it had in Europe, where craftsmen were very much part of the scientific enterprise and had, sort of done major innovations in technology. And Saha, and before him, P.C. Ray, his mentor and teacher, they had both written about how this Hinduism had particularly kind of separated the ways in which you need, because of the caste system, you had demarcated what a caste can or cannot do, and therefore there was no way in which science could flourish under these conditions. It's only much later in the 20th century that you begin to see, as science gains ascendancy, that you see scientists willing to, do experimental science. Of course, Raman did experimental science very early on, but he's an exception rather than the rule. So I think maybe we can stop here, and I can take questions etc. It's very hard to talk without looking at my audience, but anyway, I think I might just stop and see what you thought and what your reactions are.
Thank you, ma'am. This was deeply insightful, and I found it really interesting and very informative also. I would request the audience to raise their hands. There's an option at the like right at the bottom of the screen to raise your hand. So if you have a question, you just raise your hand, and I'll check whether there are any questions or any raised hands. I'll just check.
No, I think if people ask, unmute themselves and
I
ask the
think that's a
question, that
better
would be
idea.
great.
If you
Yeah, that
but
is the best.
raising, I think Debuttam Saha has raised their hand.
Yeah,
Would you like to go
Devottam,
ahead?
go ahead.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. And it's really an honor to listen to you every time whenever I get a chance to listen to you. I'm more of a it's more of a clarification that I need, particularly around the methodological part where you were talking about this interrelationship between science and social, to put it in a simple words. And uh, how to put it, like even still the assumption is that at some point of time that science and social, as if they're two very different realities, if I put it correctly, or if I so and it doesn't go in that sense. Well, we can use it interchangeably as well, science slash social or social slash science, because it's still have this assumption that there is as you were talking about, this internal and externality of sciences particularly. And so it's more of a clarification that I'm looking for. Secondly, particularly I'm just wondering, has there been which I always wonder sometimes, like because of the fact that Meghnad Saha and Ambedkar, both of them were contemporary at some point of time, has there been an interaction between them, and what would have been the nature of that interaction, and how it came out, and has there been an interaction at all? So yeah, on that.
No, both excellent questions. No, I for the sake of clarity, I think what I'm trying to say is that you cannot separate the two. The external and internal, intrinsic dimension of science is inseparable in a way. And sometimes all you can say is, in some fields, it's easier to remain inside. But if you actually look at the framework of these theories within, say, physics, they are ideological, I would say. I mean, and lots of people have written quite persuasively, on that. But, we are kind of bound, we are kind of restricted by the language that we have. How do we understand the whole of science, WHOLE, without sort of, and at the same time talk about various dimensions within it, which is the social and the, sort of laboratory, which is also a social space. But when you're just kind of honing in on a particular phenomena that you're studying, the outside does intrude in, regardless of what you might do. But so it's a limitation of language, but the two are intrinsically connected, and their connections are sometimes stronger. You can see the social much more vividly, and sometimes these become hidden because we've already developed frameworks that then make it all opaque. I, as a scientist, when I did my science, if somebody had to ask me, where is the social dimension of the kind of work I was doing, I would have been, totally unable to answer that question. Because, when I'm looking at, the spectra of phenol or whatever, I'm not really there is no, nothing in the social world that I can think about. But when you are in the process of formulating theories, etc., then of course, perhaps, and as many people have shown, these considerations come in. So anyway, so that was the first question. The second, about Meghnad Saha and Ambedkar, that has really been, I've been so intrigued by it, and and yet there's absolutely, I mean, I've seen Saha's archives quite thoroughly, I would think. and but not Ambedkar's. But this doesn't seem to be. He at one point in his biography, which I'm told was dictated by him, there is this thing that he had a sentence that he had great respect for Ambedkar, and Saha is very much involved in so the river management, etc., things close to Ambedkar as well. And yet you find that there is no interaction between them, and which I have not really. I wish somebody would look deeper into it, because it's kind of amazing that they would not have met or have discussed issues that because they have so many commonalities. Yeah, maybe you'll work on it and see. Yeah.
Ma'am, there is a very interesting question in the comments actually. How would you problematize the glorification of Ayurveda as a struggle against colonial Western science vis-a-vis the way it reinforces upper caste pedagogy?
How would I?
This is by Vena.
Can I look at it from?
Sure. Can you see the chat, ma'am?
See, I do Zoom, so this must be chat. Yeah.
The messenger.
Yeah. How would you problematize Ayurveda struggling in school? You see, this is. I mean, I think I should want to think about it, because I don't think it's either or. I think there are ways in which colonialism actually thwarts indigenous knowledges, right? There's a way in which colonialism interacts with the caste system in India, and either appropriates certain knowledges, accords them certain hierarchy, or doesn't, right? So in today's world, in this post-colonial world, we should pay attention to the ways in which colonialism thwarts indigenous knowledges, and also at the same time be aware of what is the how these knowledges come about, whose knowledges are there, because there's also been a lot of appropriation within India by the upper caste of knowledge systems of the subaltern, right? So it's not just a question of that, I think you have to look at who's doing the glorification, and what is the political and social gain that comes. I mean, it's a multi-million-dollar, if not billion-dollar industry right now, Ayurveda, with all kinds of, sham and artists that have, captured the imagination of large numbers of Indians. But at the same time, I would say to throw the baby with the bathwater, this may not be true either, may not be very good either, because there are certain ways in which Ayurveda, or Unani medicine for that matter, after all, these are knowledge systems that have some good in it. Just because, I mean, just as I critique modern science, it's not that I'm anti-science. So we have to be critical. We have to have a critical lens through which we look at these traditional knowledges. And in an ideal world, we would take what is democratic, what is good, what is feasible, and create, an amalgam of sorts. But we are kind of stuck in this place where there's a lot to be gained by just, sort of talking about Ayurveda as some incredible thing, which is, again, you can't touch it. But at the same time, somebody needs to do the study as to whose knowledges were there, what is the historicity, how did we come to these knowledge systems. So it's true that the current, the ways in which the upper castes have taken to Ayurveda and made it almost an international issue is to be critiqued, but I would say with historicity and with the understanding that all traditions, including our present traditions, should be subject to criticism. I don't know whether I'm answering the question or not.
I just had a comment to add to that, ma'am. May I?
Yes, of course.
So about the national symbol that has become in India, the Ayurveda is the science of India, they say. So basically, there are several tribal medicinal like medicinal plants that they use, and tribal medicine is there in India, but there is not much talk about it, as Ayurveda is being glorified and being sold to the West as a kind of a Eastern Oriental. There's also an Orientalist discourse to this, because Ayurveda is being exoticized in a manner, and there's no such conversation around tribal medicine. So that is very interesting. Tribal medicine is usually from the scheduled tribes. They are the ones who came up with tribal medicines. There is no talk about it, but Ayurveda is being sold to the West. So there's certainly a kind of erasure that is happening around tribal medicine and glorification of Ayurveda. So that is something that I was thinking about.
No, I think you're absolutely right. But here I would suggest to you that it's about capitalism in a way.
Yes.
What we are able to sell tomorrow. If they can capitalize on certain subaltern techniques and knowledges, they will do that too, because capitalism, the bottom line is whether you can make profit or not. So
Yes.
in fact, some little work, and I really am not, I haven't visited in a long time, because there was a book, Green Imperialism, that talked about the knowledge systems in Kerala, the ecology and other things, and here again, you see in sort of Native American traditions, the ways in which philosophically it is much more amenable to this climate to thinking about the climate crises.
Exactly.
So it's actually coming back, and I wouldn't be surprised if people found ways to capitalize on that too, for that matter, right? So because at the end, how does it's true that the hierarchy of caste seems that it is there forever, and yet if one actually, I do believe that it can change subtly. If you see the ways in which the trader castes in India have accumulated huge amounts of wealth, how would that translate, say, few decades down the road in terms of, and already you see a lot of kind of erasure of caste. If you look at just the upper caste, there's not that kind of rigidity that was there earlier. So I think that the elephant in the room here is, of course, capitalism, in terms of what they are able to exploit, and with what finesse. And so so Ayurveda has been amazing. I mean, you cannot go to, in my neighborhood, there must be 5 studios for doing all kinds of exercises and all, which and they do all the rituals around it as well, anyway.
Can I add something here? Hi,
Yes.
hi, Avadi.
Hey, good to see you.
Yeah. Sandeep is also here. So I think what Ananya was talking about tribal medicine, I think we should be talking about tribal medicine with some bit of caution, So, for example, we have it's not that tribal medicine is not talked about.
Speak up a little, Kumar.
Yeah, for example, it's not the fact that tribal medicine is not talked about. For example, the Santal medicine compiled by P.O. Boding and published from Asiatic Society, it is still in circulation, and they are making a lot of money. Asiatic Society, it sells hundreds of copies of tribal Santal medicine. And now, the fact is that there are about 300 prescriptions in the in that book that Boding compiled, so 100 years ago. Now, thing is that when you go to the tribal villages, and you find very few of the prescriptions are being in use. It's not that, I mean, there is one argument that because of the ecological disbalance, because of deforestation and all these, you don't get the ingredients and so on. But I have checked for my own eyes that you get the ingredients, but because of the differences in efficacy, you have certain things. You are suffering from malaria, and if you ask someone to chew the chirata things or drink chirata pani, then it doesn't work. So, or when you are suffering from fever and paracetamol works. So there is something. On the other hand, there are certain things which are still in very much in use. So uh, the the problem here is, but a section of uh, people, NGOs, they romanticize tribal medicine and actually make an attempt to replace paracetamol with that of tribal medicine, because they do not demand that a hospital or a functioning public health center be set up in the tribal areas. So you go to Jharkhand and see. I mean, I worked in a village where the nearest private public health center was 26 kilometers away. And once there was some kind of functioning, some kind of local, the the public health system worked a bit, then uh, people people visited the center. I mean the center which was set up locally. So here you have to. One is the uh, kind of knowledge we have. You have to acknowledge it that we have a kind of knowledge, but which can best be uh, examine what kind of knowledge it is, how much efficacy it has on these. It depends upon the ability of the local people to to compare. You, I mean, I cannot compare how the efficacy of certain medicine because I don't live there. So these are the things that you do not provide primary schools, you do not provide education, you do not provide the primary health center, and you replace the and again, I mean, it is a colonial inheritance that you read the district gazetteers. In one page, the district gazetteer says that the Adivasis, the tribals, they don't say Adivasi, the tribals are, I mean, they don't like modern medicine. They use the modern. I mean, then again, I'm not going into the modernity or other debate. Yeah. So, but they say that they don't like modern medicine. They are averse to modern medicine. But after 30, 40 pages, you find that the gazetteer claims that there was a public health program there was a immunization program, and it was hugely successful. Now, if the tribals were averse to modern medicine, and then how come that the immunization program was so successful? So these are certain. I mean, again, what you said last was the question of democracy, the question of representation. If we had certain, I mean, a good representation of the tribals in our discourse, we could actually know what is happening, what do they want, or what do not they. So all depends. I mean, the large vacuum that has been created by the deficit of democracy is being filled up by our imagination. I mean, the imagination of the powerful.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. No, all knowledges are built on prior knowledges, and it's just a question of whether we acknowledge it explicitly or not. And so it's not that, not everything about tribal medicine would be great, but there would be many, many things, because after all, people have been experimenting with herbs and, whatever, their own environment, and would have come up with over experience about what works, what doesn't work. So it's not rocket science, but it's the ways in which colonialism intervenes and appropriates, and then makes everything creates a dichotomy between traditional and colonial knowledges. That's the problem. You see, if we were to be open-minded and talk about how the whole world has contributed. I mean, these are the ways in which one looks at history of science. Either we look at history of science as something that has moved over periods, right? It was not always that Western science was in the ascendancy. It's only a sort of much more recent phenomenon. Earlier, you have scientific centers in China, in India, and even if you look at the rise of modern science, it wasn't all over Europe. It was, Spain and Italy, which are, etc. So, as Bernal has taught us that, if you look at the ways, and again, now China is again in ascendancy in terms of, scientific and technological innovation as they pour in huge amounts of money on it. So these are historical in nature. And so we need to really pay attention to that. And with our, sensibilities about colonialism and all, we might, there is some virtue in saying, no, it's not all. It's, it's not that we just don't say that Western science it's all about, or modern science. It's to understand the composite nature of modern science also. You see, it has contributions from all, I mean, the Bernal son has written about the Afro-Asiatic roots of modern science. It's quite a persuasive treatise, I would think.
So, Abha, I have a question.
Yes.
So it was really interesting and informative talk, actually. I mean, I learned a lot. So the question that I have is about this Saha versus Bhabha debate that took place right after Nehru came into power, and about how the higher education should be organized in India. And Saha was in favor of building universities rather than these islands of excellence that Bhabha was in favor of. So do you think that it has also to do something with the caste, and because Saha was in favor of this because he thought then it can attract local talent, people who are not necessarily going to these big cities and these to these islands, but rather can do pretty useful work if they're attached to these local places. I mean, have you actually given a thought into this?
Just very briefly, and but it's something that one should really look at in more detail, because it is very much about democratization of science on the one hand, because sort of universities are accessible to many more people than these exclusive science centers. But in the name of excellence and the ways in which Bhabha is able to utilize his foreign connections and has a direct line to, I mean, actually Nehru comes in very prominently in this debate, in the sense that Bhabha is able to reach out to Nehru and become very friendly than Saha, who was in fact one of the earliest scientists to have reached out to Nehru. And there was some problem that happened, there's this all scientific intrigue and other things and of course Nehru himself comes from this very upper caste and upper class background, and probably had much more in common with Bhabha than Saha. But if you look at that period, I mean, there is a way in which Saha is saying, I'm your Desdemona. He uses the term basically, and the Iagos of the world are taking over, and he's sort of trying to tell Nehru that just please don't abandon me at this time. I've been with you for the longest period. But, I mean, that's also I would say the class position that Nehru has. He's much more comfortable. And if you actually look at Mahalanobis's role in the Planning Commission, why do we have so much more funding for tertiary education proportionally than to primary education, which really does not build a whole base, the vast base that one could have built by paying much more attention to primary education. And, like China did. China was able to become literate within, a very short period, whereas India kept, sort of had huge illiteracy. So I think that here, of course, caste and class both come in majorly in the ways in which Indian development discourse takes hold. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Would anybody like to ask any more questions?
I have one more question. I don't know whether it's
Sure, go ahead, sir.
relevant to Avadi, but relevant for us, everybody. I mean, there is a big difference between some of the Indian states, namely Kerala and Bengal, in terms of science education. In Kerala, at high secondary level, about 44 or 45% of the all students, they study pure science. Pure science. I did the statistics by taking physics as proxy for pure science. So in Kerala, it was 45%. In Bengal, it was 12%.
12.
12.
Oh.
Yeah, 12. And it's also there is a big difference in the literacy rate between Kerala and Bengal, and there is a big difference in the not caste structure, of course caste structure, but also in the movement against caste. So, is there something? I mean, I have somehow. Is there some connection here? I mean, everybody should have to
Yeah, I would not know where to begin. Yeah.
And that's why in all the institutes or science faculty, science students, you do not see many of the Mondal or Bauri or Das, as you see, Chattopadhyay, Bandyopadhyay, and of course Chaube. Chaube is
Particularly.
No, it's interesting, Kumarda. So I was talking to an administrative person here, and she was saying, "Oh, you are from Bengal, but from Bengal we only hear about Mukherjees and Banerjees." This is what she said. I mean, it was not like, because that's what you encounter really. That's the other people
So
that you.
in a way, you are also subaltern here, like Molloy. Molloy is also here.
There's somebody who's raised his hand.
Yes, Devottam Saha has raised their hand, and Shondip Mondol. So we'll take both of the questions together, and then we'll go on to the comments and answers. So I'd request Devottam Saha to begin.
No, I just listening to the discussion. It's kind of came. I was about to ask. I forgot that time actually. About you just mentioned about this interesting connection between Bojendranath Sheel, who was also a very interesting figure at that point of time, particularly in Bengali intelligentsia, who was a philosopher and apparently was close to Tagore himself also for some time.
And very close to Mahalanobis.
Yeah. So, and actually, I was just wondering what would have been a nature of relationship between Meghnad Saha and Bojendranath Sheel. Like, though they are very different ideological stands when it comes to the question of caste structure, but has there been an interaction between them, and what would have been the nature of it? And secondly, which is largely has to do with this entire, which is not necessarily directly related with the topic, but I've been for a year in Indian Statistical Institute, and interestingly, so it was very interesting to see how this caste network works, and typically male caste networks, and so every now and then a new scientist joining the institute, the first thing that they search is that who are the Banerjee, Mukherjees, and Chakrabortis over here, and to then kind of make an interesting network to validate their position, particularly in the institute. And interestingly, ISI there's been a very interesting report around that historically has been, I think it might also go with IITs as well, is that it has 0.3% of representation of SC and ST communities, with even across the academic and non-academic workers, and which led to the huge amount of controversy over there. And while I was reading Mahalanobish's part, and I was thinking why ISI had this entire history, and it shows how this history coming. Even it's also very interesting that how Tagore himself, when he inaugurated Vishwabharati, who was also very close to Mahalanobish, for a long time didn't admit SC and ST students, and there was a particular provision for it that only Brahmins can join the university. Later on, it kind of made certain shifts in the academic milieu of that university. So it's actually largely on the question of merit, if I put it in the most, how this entire idea of merit has been considered, and it's always being seen to be, particularly in the contemporary times, as something juxtaposed with reservation. A reservation as something, the marker of backwardness, and something, and which is typically opposed with the entire idea of merit, which is typically of Brahmins domain. That sort of idea, it's always been there. Yeah, thank you.
No, absolutely. I mean, these are very important issues. I think Seal is very close to Mahalanobis. In fact, the whole concept of Mahalanobis distance comes from, his interactions with Seal. Anyway, but what you're saying here is, why does this nexus continue into this day? And I think that I think it's the caste and class both. The ways in which India's path to development has been, imagined and sort of put in place is very problematic, where you exclude large numbers of people from even getting to the stage where you could do science and then this whole idea of meritocracy, which is, I don't, one actually tries to understand what the definition is. It may well be that how well you speak English, for heaven's sakes. It may have nothing to do with your, and again, what I was trying to do earlier, which I didn't do, was to think about caste and religion for this talk, which, even this critique that Saha has, such minor critique of the dissociation of mind from the hand, and which actually he gets from Ray, P.C. Ray, who was his mentor, that created so much furor. And so, so all of these questions that you are relating, I mean, Sandeep's question, and they were your question about, how do we understand the ways in which India's academic or research enterprise has taken off or not taken off, and how imbricated it is with the notions of caste and class is worth examining, as not as individual institutions or as individual scientists that I have done, but just to rather look at the sociology of this phenomena, of how it continues to reinforce, despite reservations, I would say. No? I don't know.
I did see Sandeep Mondol raise his hand, but I cannot find them on the participants list. I think they might have left the meeting. They might have got disconnected or something. So another thing that I was thinking about, ma'am, I would like to ask you is that the lack of interdisciplinary research or studies or education in the school level. I mean, when we see, I myself was a student of science till my +2s, and I saw people complain about reservation in my class, and the upper caste people complained about reservation in IITs and IIMs, and then they went on to study science, basically. And the people who left science and joined humanities departments in universities, in liberal arts universities in India, like JU, JNU, and they kind of unlearned the habit of the casteism that they picked up in school. And they unlearned that habit, and they realized that reservation is actually not against merit. It is not an economic amelioration process. It's a social upliftment process, and it's necessary right now. So this unlearning happened only because we were exposed to to a kind of education which allowed us to unlearn, which taught us that, which made Ambedkar and Perrier essential reading in classrooms. And this did not happen with the people who were pursuing quote unquote pure science or STEM fields, like technological fields, engineering, medicine, or let's say science honor subjects. And this is very interesting that I noticed when I went to my school reunion. I saw the students who were still pursuing science and doing their research in science and working in the STEM fields. They were still had that idea that reservation is purely evil, the upper caste students, and they also thought that the Brahmins are at the top because they deserve it apparently. And this kind of bias, this kind of very dangerous thought process was in them. And the students who left that pure science field and pursued something that is more humanities based or interdisciplinary, they kind of changed their ideas, they unlearned it. This is something interesting that I noticed, and I think there is an immense need for interdisciplinary and humanities and science based, like both working together in the school +2, at least the +2 and the secondary school level, which I think is important, especially in a context like India. Would you like to add to that, ma'am? Would you like to say something about that?
No, I think you're absolutely right. But, I mean, I want to kind of sort of preface what I'm going to say with the fact that even to think in terms of higher education and college or university level, already we have excluded huge numbers of people. So at every stage you find that in the policies, in the discourses, you have a reinforcement of the existing hierarchies. And the question is, how do we break that? I mean, if the world history is any indication or very recent history, it is only through struggle. I think classrooms are important, very important places where teachers have enormous influence on people. But one way to raise the consciousness of the larger group is through struggle, right? You see that in the US very clearly. You see, the civil rights movement, in the 20th century. I mean, earlier, we can keep going back or you look at the feminist movement, you begin to see that how that is so instrumental in changing hearts and minds. And then they force the school curriculum to rethink. I mean, MIT now, if you look at it, it's a completely, within 2 decades, it used to be hardly any women, and now it's women not dominate, but they're 50% of the incoming class, etc. So I think that we have to think about everything, because JNU and presidency or whatever colleges we are thinking of, or Jadavpur, these are tiny places that do not touch the lives of huge numbers of people. So while I'm all for having a much sort of encompassing and broader curriculum, which is very important, but I think we also need to have continuous pressure by organizing, by not letting it just drop by the wayside, and which is what is happening, right? We are all sort of busy, kind of involved in our own lives, and so I would pay a lot more attention to creating movements. And if you actually look today at the rise of Hindutva, for 30 years they have been, doing their own propaganda machines and doing the work, and through Rath Yatras, etc. It's but so and we have kind of receded into kind of doing our own scholarship, etc. So unless our scholarship in some ways is also an integral part of the struggles, I think we will continue to speak only to the few and far in between. So yeah, but you're absolutely right. We do need to, and at primary school levels, where you lay the foundation of many things, it's very important to have a more inclusive framework of thinking and doing.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, ma'am, for that wonderful response. And I don't see anybody else raising their hands. If anybody would like to go ahead and ask a question, you're free to do so. But I think we have to take this question as the last question, because I am sure time is running out. If anybody would like to ask a question, we can take that. I'll just check the chat also in case anybody has left a comment, but I don't see any.
Yeah, no, I think it's, yeah. Sridhar has raised a hand.
Yeah. Would you like to go ahead?
Madam, I have joined in between, so I do not know where I am. So I would like to pose a small assessment made by Frederick Cooper in the context of African colonialism in question, where these identity questions are raised. So he asked that this is leading to essentialism, where there are two ways to lose oneself: by a walled segregation in the particular or by a dilution in the universal. So here he takes the case of tribes, and he says that tribes are not caged. They also have to face the liberalization and after decolonization, liberalization and etc. By making them caged, these identity movements are essentializing and producing essentialist categories that is leading to caging them, uncaging them. So I'm worried that whether by doing this is very exciting, this debate that is going on, but whether feminism or the tribal identity or Dalit identity, here it's I feel it's a warning. Governments also now now present government in the nation state itself is owning whatever Dalit and other identity struggles have claimed, that our history is subordinated, our history is erased. So now they are also claiming the same.
Yeah.
So in that context, can't we see any? I'm wondering there is a need to think about it.
No, I agree. There's certainly a need to think about it. But, it becomes so fractious, because what does it mean when we say, again, I'm just going back to what I said earlier. I mean, we can't all just only think and talk. We have to, what are the actions that are, that accompany that are important. And for me, I think sometimes these become very thorny questions, because at the same time, nobody can deny that there is systematic oppression of the subaltern classes, and the world is getting more and more unequal. So so in that response, you have identity formations which are in response to the oppression that is felt, right? But that can only take you so far. Like you said, it's another way to then encage yourself or whatever. But and of course, historically, we'll have so many different strands, and that would compete with each other. So sometimes I find it easier to think of the world we'd like to be in, where sort of to say that, oh, this knowledge came from here or there becomes irrelevant. We absorb the best of knowledge systems. We live in a egalitarian world, etc., where our own personal proclivities about what our tastes are or what are become, our personal proclivities. They don't have huge impact. I think I'm kind of going round and round, but I do understand the contradiction of asserting a particular identity and the pitfalls that might come with that, right? But at the same time, without assertion of subaltern identities, how do you transform, right? You can't negate it either, because the world around us, continuously imposes these identities on us. No? I don't know whether I'm answering your question, or even I understood it.
No, I am not dismissive, madam. Yeah. But there is also, and I'm general. It's a general observation. Yeah. These identity struggles are reservations as such also. And they are in such a pattern that individual inclusion and social exclusion is a pattern that is going on.
Yeah, that's
so
a good.
in such a situation, so how to engage with that? We need to democratize, but but in that we should not essentialize. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, and no, I get your point, but what I'm trying to think through is whether the difference between essentialism and giving due credit where it belongs. We were talking mainly about science and knowledge systems. The suppression of knowledge. So how do you set the historical record correct? How do you set it right would be a question. So I think that as long as we live in a divided world, identities and identity politics is not going to disappear, right? But I'm totally with you that the world that we should dream of and the world that we should strive for should be free of these essentialist identities. No, am I getting you correctly? Or
but how? It is a difficult question. Thank you, madam.
Exactly.
Really tough question.
Absolutely. Yeah, if there was an answer to it, we would be in a better place already.
Exactly. And I see in the chat, Jayanto Bhushan Bhattacharya says illuminating. So just to add to that. And I think that's, we've had a very interesting discussion, very informative and illuminating discussion, as said by Jayanto Bhushan Bhattacharya sir. And I see there are no raised hands, and I think I for one has had a wonderful time, and I think we all have had a wonderful time today. And thank you, ma'am, so much. Thank you so much for joining us today and making this evening a very insightful one. And thank you to everybody for joining today and leaving your comments, leaving your questions with us to ponder over. And I think that's all for today. Have a good night and take care of yourself. Good night and goodbye.
Thanks a ton. This was lovely.
This was lovely. Yes, indeed.
Bye.